We are back, and we are joined now by Rebecca Jane Morgan, author of Gender Heretics, Evangelicals, Feminists, and the Alliance Against Trans Liberation. Rebecca, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you because I've been on a war against TERFs for a little bit here on this program. Gotten a little heated on that front, so I have,
She's looking to ground herself.
Yes, I have immense anger towards them, obviously, for being transphobic. And so what might be helpful is for you and your expertise to trace the origin of them. And then also, they're kind of seemingly anachronistic based on their other stated beliefs, alliance with evangelicals. So let's just start with some simple definitions for people in the audience that may not be familiar. What is a TERF, and how did that moniker come to be?
Sure, yeah. So a TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It was coined in 2008 by a feminist blogger who was just trying to find a term that was sort of easy to use to describe people who self-identify as feminists but don't include trans people. So that's where it comes from. There's a lot of debate about whether it's a good term or not. Personally, I don't think it is. I don't think there's any problem with using it, just it's not very accurate. Primarily because well, number one, a lot of these people, unfortunately, are not looking to just exclude trans people. They're looking to exterminate trans people. And number two, a lot of them are not radical feminists, and many of them aren't even feminists at all. So there we go.
Yeah, I mean, so why do they call themselves radical? And are they only radical in the fact that they hate trans people and they find that to be subversive? Because radical feminist theory would eschew, and I would imagine does eschew, these kinds of folks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there used to be a myth that in the 1970s, radical feminism was sort of uniquely transphobic. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of radical feminists at the time were specifically trans-inclusive. And there were many trans people who were themselves radical feminists. I think there's debate about why radical feminism specifically seems to be so closely related with transphobia. Part of it is just the fact that trans visibility was rising at exactly the time that radical feminism was becoming more of a thing in the 70s. So I think there were problems in feminist theory, issues about how do we define what a woman even is, that have been around for centuries. It was just that in the 70s, radical feminists came along. They were very irreverent, very willing to be, in people's faces. And unfortunately, that was the same time when trans identities were becoming into the popular mainstream.
And the evangelical piece. I mean, you are a Christian yourself. What inspired you, I guess, to analyze this connection between evangelicals and TERFs?
Oh yeah. So I mean, the main thing that motivated me was the fact that in evangelical literature on this subject, almost all of it references TERF literature, or so-called gender critical literature, anti-trans literature, basically. So I was really interested in that because, I mean, a lot of the people who are writing this anti-trans doctrine are very different to a radical feminist on other issues, say like reproductive rights. So it's a strange sort of combination. So yeah, I really wanted to know where that came from, why that alliance specifically exists, and also what effect it's had on evangelical beliefs about this subject. So yeah.
Yeah, and you do such a wonderful job of like explaining the theology to someone like me, who's not religious at all, and I want to get into that for sure. But what surprised me is just how you look at and trace what the history of evangelical opposition to trans rights really goes back to and when it started. And I was surprised to see certain quotes supportive of trans people from Christian and evangelical ministers in the 60s and 70s. So what is that history, and when did it really kind of shift so rapidly?
Yeah. So, if anyone, for anyone in the audience who's already sort of familiar with the history of the so-called moral majority in America, the Christian right, and particularly its relationship with reproductive rights, the history of evangelicalism and trans identity kind of has a similar trajectory. So, in the early 70s and late 60s, a lot of evangelicals were very either ambivalent towards abortion or pro-choice. And it was only later that this impression that evangelical theology automatically leads to super conservative views came along. The same is true with trans issues. So in 1966, Johns Hopkins University performed the first what was then called a sex change in its facility, not the first ever, but the first at that facility. And a local journalist actually decided, for some reason, I don't know why, that they were going to go around all the local religious leaders and ask what they think about this surgery. I think there was 14 of them. So, Catholics, all sorts of Protestant ministers. 13 of them either had a mixed or positive perspective, including the local Southern Baptist minister. A guy called Roy Gresham, who said simply, "This is an area of medical science and not morally prohibitive." That's his quote. So, and that continues into the early 70s. It's 1971. Another Southern Baptist minister called David Edens says that he has worked with some trans people as a counselor, and says he recognizes in them a similar transformation to the transformation he sees in rebirth, the Christian idea of being born again. And he says we need to use our medical knowledge, our skills to improve the lives of everyone, including trans people. And in Oklahoma, the Baptist General Hospital in Oklahoma City was one of the regional hubs for so-called sex change surgery at this time. It was only banned in 1977. When there was still dissent on the board of the local Baptist convention about whether this was good or not. So yeah, this idea that if you're an evangelical you have to be transphobic is really quite recent. And just one last sort of quote to illustrate the point. Pat Robertson, one of the
We
most
played this. We played this on our show. Yeah.
Yeah, in 2013, and it also happened in 2001. But in 2013, he says, an audience member sent in a question about this issue, and his co-host is like visibly anti-trans, and he just says it's not for you to decide or judge. And it's only later that he retracts that statement because of pressure from other conservative leaders. So fundamentally, yeah, there's nothing in evangelical theology, and this is one of the big arguments I make in the book. There's nothing in evangelical theology that leads automatically to transphobia. It's something that's exerted on it from outside.
So when's the moment that you see it really have this kind of massive change?
Well, it depends on the country. I mean, here in the UK, it really changed around sort of the early 2000s when we had something called the Gender Recognition Act going through Parliament. So the Evangelical Alliance, which is our biggest evangelical group, hadn't said anything, almost nothing about trans issues until this proposition came along. And then all of a sudden, they started to really pay attention to some super conservative American and British theologians. So they positioned themselves sort of against the Gender Recognition Act. But interestingly, part of why they did that isn't because they particularly cared about trans issues. It was because the Gender Recognition Act, in its early stages, potentially would have created some same-sex marriages. It was just a side effect of that. So that was the thing that really got them sort of worked up. So that's kind of when it starts to kick off in the UK. In the US, it depends. A lot of it doesn't even happen until the 2010s.
Right, right. With the bathroom bills.
with the bathroom bills, with the the sports stuff, all sorts of issues that just suddenly come along in the mid to late 2010s. Gamergate played a bit of a role in this. Transphobic memes online kind of kicked off during and after Gamergate. But the point is, it's really recent, and if it's recent, that prompts the question: well, is it really going to stay that long? Can we fix it? And it's difficult, but I think there are signs that we can.
Well, we've talked about this in this program, at least in terms of like the electoral salience of this. At Germentum has a great piece, but it's just the Republicans that are running on transphobia are like have not done well electorally. It's just not something that resonates with people, and I guess that's a semblance of hope on this front.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're losing battles that electoral battles that they really should be winning right now at this point in the electoral cycle. Same here in the UK. I mean, the Conservative Party, which has really been leaning into transphobia, is like 15, 20 points behind in the polls. I mean, it's not working.
Yeah.
And that points to, I think, something really important about this is that the transphobic rhetoric is a tactic. It's not a strategy. It's about consolidating their base, getting their base fired up. But in the long term, it's really repulsive to a lot of people, including conservatives. In the US and the UK, polling data seems to suggest that a lot of young evangelicals are just either moving more in a progressive direction or really just don't care.
Yeah.
So it's not a long-term strategy, and they will have to move on from it at some point. The downside of that, of course, is that when they move on from trans people, they'll go back to someone else. Maybe they'll go back to, my guess is they'll probably go back to primarily anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican rhetoric, the border. But yeah, it's not working, and they will have to move on.
Yeah, and I mean, you wrote a Medium piece about your book, and I encourage everybody to read the full thing. But this quote here really is a great summary of a lot of what you try to argue. In your book, you explain how a mutual distaste for dualist philosophies that place the will of the soul, i.e., what the soul or mind thinks about itself, above the material form of the body, i.e., what the body naturally is, brought some evangelical theologians and feminist theories together in the mid-20th century. So there's a lot to chew on there. Can you explain that and what those philosophies mean in practice, and why this connection, now that we bring it back to TERFs, was forged with evangelicals?
Yeah, absolutely. So this will sort of circle back to the issue of the worth of the worthwhileness, I guess, of this as an electoral strategy. So in particularly the 20th century, mid-20th century, a lot of trans autobiographies, which for many people was sort of where they got their information about trans people, a lot of trans autobiographies use this framing of "I was born in the wrong body." And this is, a lot of trans people still use this phraseology. I still use it sometimes, although I started to realize that people just misinterpret it all the time. But a lot of anti-trans thinkers, or people who became anti-trans, really misinterpreted this, like severely misinterpreted this. They started to think that what trans people were saying was literally that my body and my soul are separate entities. And in Christian theology, particularly at this time in the mid-20th century, there was this big pushback against what's called Gnosticism. To sort of give a brief summary, Gnosticism is this ancient collection of Christian mysticisms that were prevalent in the sort of 1st to 3rd century. And what they believed, contrary to what's now considered the Orthodox Christian belief, what they believed is that precisely that the body and soul were separate. That the real God created the soul, and the soul is sexless, and then this lesser God, the demiurge, created the body, which is sexed, and stuffed souls into it. And that's what they think Adam and Eve is all about. So Gnosticism has a really bad reputation in Christianity. And one of the things that a lot of Christian ethicists do is, when they don't like something, but they can't quite pin down what they don't like about it. They just accuse it of being Gnostic because it works. Gnosticism has a toxic reputation. So I think this speaks to why the temperature is so high right now in terms of evangelical rhetoric on this subject, because a lot of this stuff isn't really designed to convince other people. It's designed to keep evangelical believers in line, because no one cares about Gnosticism. The only people who care about this are people who already know a little bit about Christian theology. And the way this relates to the feminist sort of angle, the so-called TERFs, is that TERFs essentially had the same philosophical objection to trans identities. They still do. In 1979, Janice Raymond wrote this book, The Transsexual Empire. It's infamous, it's toxic, horrible, full of invective and just it's like the 1979 equivalent of a transphobic soyjack, if that even makes sense.
Right.
So but she made the same point. She argued that trans identity is similar to Gnosticism, and she did this before any evangelical theologian had done that. So that this is the same fundamental philosophical objection. And nowadays there's a bit more of a divergence, at least with language, because feminists don't talk about Gnosticism because no one cares about Gnosticism. Instead, they say that trans identity is the worst aspect of postmodernism. But the objection is still the same, that trans identity is like propagating this schism between body and soul.
Is that a fundamental anxiety about like the spiritual realm being outside of the material? Or like outside of the body that we can physically kind of touch or perceive? Is that the anxiety there?
So on the Christian side, the anxiety primarily is that this is an issue of soteriology, whether you're saved or not. So if you don't believe in the argument, and it falls down under scrutiny, but the argument is that if you don't believe in the Christian, Orthodox Christian idea of the body and soul, well, then you don't believe in Christianity and you can't be saved, because you're fundamentally misunderstanding what Jesus was about. On the feminist side, it's more about, after the Second World War, in books like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, there was really this pushback against the idea that womanhood is found in the body. Her famous phrase, de Beauvoir's famous phrase was, woman is not created such that society makes this being. So ideas of the social constructedness of gender were really starting to come into the cultural zeitgeist. And in the 70s, there was a bit of a pushback. 70s and 80s, there was a pushback against this. What was called, they called it somatophobia, fear of the body. There was a push to really reinsert the body into the conversation about how human identities are formed. And Raymond tried to position her arguments, and here in the UK, Germaine Greer tried to position her arguments as part of that pushback against somatophobic ideas about the body. So on the feminist side, it's anxiety about losing that connectedness with the body, that epistemological connectedness.
Right.
On the Christian side, it's about soteriology more than anything.
So, a lot of it to me feels like a fundamental, also like, and the theology that you describe and the philosophy fits into that, but this kind of opposition to modernity, and also the disrupting the natural order of one's body. How does that fit into the philosophy you describe?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It does connect very much with sort of natural, nature-based moral arguments, and that connects with then the issue of reproductive rights, because the idea is that the abortion is only made possible through the invasive presence of medical technology disrupting nature, and trans identity sort of brings up similar things, at least where surgery is concerned, or hormonal changes. So yeah, definitely, it's about not just modernity but also post-modernity. The feeling that we are losing our ability to know things for certain. The argument against that has to be quite complicated, because, well, yeah, we are losing that, but we're gaining a lot of other things as well. We're gaining the ability to understand human diversity more fully. We're gaining the ability to use Christian language, more fully appreciate the beauty of God's creation. So yeah, it is very much about fears in this sort of transitional phase that we're in between modernity and post-modernity.
And those fears seem to, from the TERF side, supersede anything that they previously opposed when it, at least, like, just whatever, J.K. Rowling, we'll just take her as an example, who tried to, espouse certain liberal ideas. I mean, Dumbledore's gay, but I didn't put that in the book. I just decided later. But like that kind of stuff. Although when you look at oddly, I was talking to Matt about this. When you look at the way that those books end, the entire order is completely maintained, and there's nothing really subversive in any way about it. Why was Hermione mocked for trying to free slaves? There's a lot of questions about the philosophy, her political ideology before this, I would say. But, at least on the surface, these kinds of folks, they call themselves feminists. They believe in, I guess, empowering biological women. And before trans people, I guess, came into their eye line, they, in theory, would have been in opposition to the evangelicals, other movement that is most hateful towards trans people. In your analysis of this, like, how do they rationalize that? Is it just that their hatred of trans people is so overwhelming that it supersedes everything, and they don't contend with those other questions?
So largely it's a sort of slippery slope argument. The argument is that there's not that many trans people. We're not a particularly good enemy, because we're not that threatening.
Right.
But the argument is that we are this sort of spear tip to this broader attack on reality, on the idea of objective truth, on the idea that any truth at all can be found in the physical universe. So it's connected with bigger anxieties, and I think one of the really important points that we need to draw out here is that often this alliance, this unlikely alliance between trans-exclusionary radical feminists and conservative evangelicals, it gets described along the terms as essentially a marriage of convenience, or a marriage of cynicism. That's often the case, but a lot of the time it really is to do with genuine, deeply held beliefs. And
Essentialism?
Of essentialism, of this holistic idea about body and soul, which they think we're attacking when we aren't really. We need to be developing better rhetorical strategies right now, because at the moment our strategy seems to be to just sort of shame the feminist angle, the feminist aspect of this alliance, for taking money from the wrong people. But it's A, it's not effective, and B, it's often not accurate, because TERF groups have a lot of money as well.
Right. Well, what would be the major takeaway that you would want our audience to come away with about this alliance, and the best way to combat some of these talking points by getting to the core?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of this does come down, certainly on the evangelical side, a lot of this comes down to us getting our crap in order. And there's not a huge amount that people can do to accelerate that outside. But for people who either are in evangelicalism or know someone who's in evangelicalism, a big part of this is don't let them have this conversation without our voice being in there. A lot of the spaces where this stuff gets propagated, whether it's news networks, whether it's churches, whether it's conferences, it's a closed feedback loop. There's no alternative perspective there. And so although it's really uncomfortable to be in that space, we need to be there as much as we possibly can, as long as we feel safe. And then also, I would say not everyone involved in this alliance is cynical. Not everyone's a grifter. Not everyone is astroturfed. It's really sort of comforting sometimes to believe that that's the case, but it isn't always. And if we take that as our starting point, a lot of our communication is going to just come across as really condescending, sort of counter to their own experience. So that's the challenge really for us over the next few years. We need to ride out this this current hysteria. It will go away, or it will sort of, the temperature will go down a little bit. And that's when the work really begins of developing better rhetorical strategies.
Well, Rebecca Jane Morgan, the book is Gender Heretics, Evangelicals, Feminists, and the Alliance Against Trans Liberation. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been really nice talking to you.
Yes, and we will put a link to your book in the description wherever people are watching or listening to this. Thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thank you.